Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is Gwen White from the Healthy Transitions TA Center, and we appreciate your spending part of your day with us and listening to some of the technical challenges we were having as we started. Gary, I'm going to ask if you have any messages for those on the phone, Gary being our technical support person.
Sure. Just that for the best audio quality, we do encourage people to dial into the audio. The phone number is and the participant code is up at the top of the chat, or you can use the dial out feature, which is located at the top of your screen. If you hear an echo effect, go ahead and mute your computer speakers, and you'll still have audio through the phone if you dial in, but that will get rid of the echo effect. And we do ask that you mute your lines after you dial in so we can avoid any audio disruptions, but there will be times for Q&A where you can chime in by phone. Of course, if you don't want to dial in, you can then put your questions and comments in the chat.
And we have a nice smaller group today, so please communicate with us in terms of questions and answers in any way you're comfortable, but we'll be able to have some dialogue both in the chat box and using your audio as you take yourself off mute. We're very pleased today to have Maryann Davis with us, talking about collaboration with non-mental health adult systems. And Maryann and my partner, Johanna, will be introducing themselves as we move along. And this learning community is hosted by Youth Move National, coordinated with the University of Maryland. We also are hosted by the Now is the Time Technical Assistance Center. So this is our fifth convening of the Transition Learning Community, TLC. We're here today because we're all dedicated to improving the lives of youth and young adults, not only dedicated, but excited about transforming the services and systems which support them. And we're all like-minded thinkers. So we're hoping to have an instructive, informative, and interactive learning support today on the issues specifically around non-traditional partners. And I am a technical assistance liaison with the Healthy Transitions Technical Assistance Center. And I'm going to turn this over to Johanna to introduce herself.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name's Johanna Bergen, and I'm the Executive Director of Youth Move National. I'm very glad to be with you one more time as we continue our work in supporting young adults of transition age. It would be wonderful if we could find out a little bit more about you and what brings you to today's call. So I invite you to share your name, the work that you do in the community that you're from in the chat box, and then we have two polling questions that we ask you to respond to. This gives Maryann, Gwen, and I an idea of who is with us on the call today. So from the choices available on your screen now, can you let us know how your organization can best be described? And we ask that you choose a best fit answer as you look at this poll. All right, and so folks are dialing in. We'll give you about 30 more seconds to submit your answer so we know a little bit more about your organization. Over half of our audience today, it looks like, are representing a state, territory, tribal, or local mental health agency. We have some public health identification on the phone with us today, some youth organizations, some family peer support. Perfect. Awesome. Youth peer support. Great. Thank you guys so much. That helps us gives us a sense of who we're talking to on today's call. The second polling question we have for you is about your role. And again, can you please provide the response in the poll that best describes your job description and your role in this work? And we'll give you a minute to fill out this poll. All right, we have several project directors of SAMHSA grants, both System of Care and Healthy Transitions, on the phone today. We have other technical assistance providers, state employees, family peer providers, youth peer providers. This is great. Awesome. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself as you joined us today. We would encourage you to keep using that chat box where you're typing your names and roles in throughout the session. As Gwen said, we're a small group today. We can be very responsive to your questions and your ideas, so please do not hesitate to share them throughout. I am really excited to be able to introduce Maryann Davis to you. We're excited that she was able to join us for one of the sessions today and is really going to take home some key messages for us around partnership with what have in the past been non-traditional partners in our children's behavioral health work and now are very necessary partners as we work to support young adults successfully transitioning to adulthood. And I know you guys are not stranger to this concept, so today we're going to get more specific with Maryann's expertise in several of these systems. And so Maryann, we're here to support you with slide changes, and we'll make sure to alert you to questions as they come up. But I'd love to pass over to you to introduce yourself and talk about today's learning objectives.
Great. Thanks, Johanna. I appreciate it. And for everybody who's on the line, I'm technically not connected exactly to the same thing that you're seeing, and so that's why I'm asking folks to forward the slides. And I'm going to trust you all to tell me if what I'm saying seems to be off topic to the slide you're seeing, because that could happen because I can't see what you're seeing exactly. So I'm Maryann Davis. I'm the director of the Transitions Research and Training Center, and within the Transitions RTC, I'm the director of the Learning and Working Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. Our work largely focuses on conducting research and developing knowledge and sharing that knowledge to improve the lives of young people who are living with a serious mental health condition as they transition into adulthood. So I was really pleased when Gwen and Johanna approached me about this topic today, because I think it's incredibly important that as we're working with young people who are imminently going to be adults, and the systems that could provide them services are largely adult systems, that we're thinking about that in a really proactive way and thinking about how we can best facilitate that connection. So our learning objectives today are to just identify who those non-mental health adult systems and partners are to further the work and support of young adults of transition age. You can read these as well as I can, so forgive me for just reading them. But we're going to describe the role and function of these systems as it relates to support of young adults of transition age. And really what I'm hoping people will be doing as we are describing some of the characteristics of these systems is to think about kind of what it is that you know about the system where you are in your community. And because everybody's system is actually remarkably different from one another, and it really is going to be a matter of thinking about ways in which it's appropriate for you to connect and them to connect to you, and how to best make those connections work for these young people. And then we want to assess sort of your current level, or we want you to assess your current level of partnering among these systems, and thinking about where can you go in the future. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. We might need some system for you to tell me when you have gone to the next slide.
We're looking at the balloons right now, Maryann.
Thanks, Gwen. All right.
You're welcome.
This is going to be an interesting process. All right. So it's really pretty straightforward. About a year ago, we talked a lot with this group, or some, I don't know if any of you who are on the call today were on that call then, but there's been a fair amount of discussion about how child and adult mental health can better connect with one another, or can strongly connect with one another. And today we really want to focus on these 4 other really centrally important systems. On the right are I would say they're the systems that we want our young people to connect to, and on the left are the ones that we often don't want them to connect to, but that are in fact often relevant in their lives. So we're going to take some time to talk about each of these 4. Could we go to the next slide? All right. So the State Vocational Rehabilitation Services, are we starting off with a polling question? I'm not sure what everybody's seeing.
Yes, the true-false questions are on the slide, Maryann.
Okay, great. So there's an incredibly important piece of federal legislation called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It mandates that that all state VR systems provide a variety of services to students who have disabilities, who are either in secondary or post-secondary schooling, that can be education or training, who are either disabled under Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, or are in special education. And so this question is a little bit around some of these specific services that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, otherwise known as the WIOA, requires state VR systems to provide to these students. So as you can see, the first one's job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, workplace readiness training, instruction in self-advocacy, and job mentors. And so I'm wanting you to just, if you're familiar with the Act, you would probably be able to know which ones are true and which ones are false. And if you're not, maybe it could be your wish list of what you would like to see as true. But this is a polling to kind of get us talking about sort of the elements of the WIOA Act.
Awesome. So Maryann, folks are responding to these true-false questions, indicating whether they know or believe them to be offered through the WIOA. And largely, Maryann, everyone is saying true to all of them.
Okay. Well, that's great. And that's wonderful thinking that they would all be, and they pretty much all are. The only one that is not actually a requirement is job mentors. There is within the requirement to provide instruction in self-advocacy, it actually states in WIOA that this could be achieved through peer mentors, more focused on self-advocacy, but job mentors are not required. But the great thing about what WIOA is bringing to the table, I would say, for the young people that we are really focused on trying to support better, is that all of these activities are now required for VR, vocational rehabilitation, which I'm going to shorten to VR systems, to provide to students. So we're going to get into some more detail about what exactly, who are students, and really who does this federal law apply to. So on the next slide, I also want to make sure that people are familiar with the VR system. It really varies from state to state about how much interaction there is between the mental health system and the state VR system. Sometimes they're in strong partnership, and sometimes they hardly know each other whatsoever. And typically when they're in strong partnership, it is on the adult mental health side of things connecting to the state VR agency. So I thought it was worthwhile to give some characteristics about VR systems. So VR systems are very strongly shaped by federal legislation. And it actually brings us probably much more of a uniformity to their work than we would find to our mental health systems. They provide direct services to people who have disabilities who are ages 16 and older. I'm not aware of any VR agencies that would work with anybody under the age of 16. They are supposed to support the development of educational vocational skills that are needed to live independently in the community. Priority is given to individuals with the most severe disabilities. This is one way in which every state often has their own definition of what they consider to be individuals with the most severe disabilities. Typically, this has something to do with how much they have in the way of resources. So the fewer the resources they have, the stricter the criteria are for who is an individual with a severe disability. But it is not defined by type of disability. So in every state, individuals with psychiatric disabilities should be under consideration for services. And then the services they provide, a lot of the services they provide are provided directly by VR counselors. They can also provide, or they can connect people to contracted services that the VR system would contract with another provider to provide. I want to draw your attention to, we'll have some links on each of these slides. These are materials that we've developed here in the Transitions RTC that are designed to be very user-friendly for young adults as well as for other folks that describe a lot of supports around vocational functioning and some of the other topics we'll be talking about today. So the first one is this brief called Vocational Rehabilitation, a Young Adult's Guide, and there's a lot of information in there about how to connect with VR services, what they are, what the eligibility criteria are, that would just give you something to refer to after the webinar today. So if we can go to our next slide. I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about the VR system. So as I said, their typical services, they provide primarily things through their VR counselors. Their VR counselors work with people to develop what they call an individual plan for employment, an IPE. These are supposed to be guided by a client's goals and interests, so they are client-chosen employment outcomes. Typically, this would be for paid employment, but some people could be starting off not seeking paid employment, but training. VR services include supports for attending college, which is important for people to potentially have access to. Standard services are focused initially on assessment and then counseling, development of their resume. There is employment coaching that can be provided, again, typically by the VR counselor, but sometimes that's a service that is contracted out. Therapeutic treatment and employment-related transportation can be all part of what services are provided through VR. I think it's important to understand there's a large subgroup of VR students that are in college or some kind of a training program. That national population includes 25,000 people with psychiatric conditions back in fiscal year 6. And these aren't figures that are necessarily updated every year. But essentially there are a large number of people that receive VR supports to go to college or in training. And then VR agencies can contract with providers. Very often what we see is that individual placement and support, which is the strongest evidence-based approach to helping adults with psychiatric disabilities obtain and keep work, and is also currently the only intervention with direct evidence of being effective in young adults. So IPS is often something that's a contracted service through the vocational rehabilitation system. Sometimes it's funded through adult mental health and others through the VR system. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So what do we know about VR outcomes? One of the things that we know, first of all, is that the amount of money that is spent on any individual who accesses VR services and the proportion of the youth they serve who have a serious mental health condition really varies from state to state. And that's not an outcome per se. It's just to say that for each of you on the phone, your state VR system may be fairly familiar with youth who have serious mental health conditions, or they may have a very tiny caseload of them and not be very familiar with them. They may have a fairly good budget. I would say everybody always feels like nobody has enough of a budget, but they may have relatively a good budget to work from, where others are just so very thinly funded that there's fairly restricted array and amount of help. But within that broad system, some of the outcomes that have been published is for, let's say, for a high-quality VR, which is, for example, what we see in Maryland. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with Maryland's Now is the Time Healthy Transitions grant activities, but Maryland has had a very strong relationship between mental health and their VR system, and their VR system has had fairly good funding. And what we see for, this is not within youth per se, this is overall, that the 12-month employment rates are 58 to 66%, and the hourly wages are about $7 an hour. So we would say the hourly wages are fairly abysmal, and however, the majority of folks have employment 12 months into services. The national average among those receiving VR services is that upon exit from VR services, a little less than half are employed.
Hey.
This is kind of a glass half full, half empty kind of picture. We'd certainly love to see higher figures, but it gives you a flavor for the types of supports and outcomes that VR.
It's gone now.
All right. If we can go on to
I think, Maryann, I'm going to interrupt you and say you have 3 minutes left on this area, and suggest that we have somebody on the phone that needs to mute themselves, because you don't want us listening to your conversation.
Yes.
Go ahead, Maryann.
That was some chattering. Thank you, Gwen. All right, so let's get back to that Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the WIOA. It's relatively new. A lot of state VR systems are just getting used to it. The final rules were published just about a year ago. It has a really strong focus on preparing youth and young adults for successful entry into the workforce. Our center has a brief that essentially has focused on what does it mean for youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions. And so if you're interested in that, you can click on this connection and download that description. If we go to our next slide. So a brief overview of WIOA. So there is an array of services that are mandated in WIOA called Pre-Employment Transitions Services, or PRE-ETS. These are the ones that we did our little poll at the beginning about. So PRE-ETS are for students with disabilities. So who are students with disabilities? Those are individuals who are enrolled in secondary or post-secondary education or training, who meet the age requirements for the provision of transition services in the state. So it's defined by each state. Typically, it usually means ages 16 to 21. It typically maps onto transition services in special education. They need to be individuals who have a disability, either who are receiving special education services under IDEA, or who would qualify as having a disability for the purpose of Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973. One of the really important things to understand if you're going to form stronger relationships with VR is that VR is used to making their connections with transition-age youth through special education. And one of the things that we know is that the majority of students who have a serious emotional disturbance do not receive services through special education. And so if they're only connecting with about 10% of students with serious emotional disturbance who are in special education, then we've got 90% of students who could potentially benefit from these pre-ETs that are not connecting through that way. So we might need some real strong advocacy to work with the VR system to help them understand that this is where they are. All right, if we go to the next slide, going back to, so these questions that I asked about, the true-false, are about the essential pre-ETS services. They are now mandated to provide that for this population. So it's a great array of pre-employment transition services, as well as, if we go to the next slide, they have some budgetary mandates within WIOA, which first of all says that they have to spend at least 15% of their federal budget on those pre-ETs. So that's a substantial portion. It's a way in which they have to focus on youth in transition. They also have to spend half of their supported employment program allotment to provide supported employment services to youth with the most significant disabilities, and that these do not have to be students. These youth are ages 14 to 24 regardless of their school status. They still have to have a disability, but it's a wider age range. And as you can imagine, when you get pre-ETs, that can then lead to also then having supported employment that are a variety of services to help people succeed in their employment setting. The other important thing about the changes in supported employment that VR services now have to provide is that it has extended for all individuals receiving supported employment. It's extended the period of time that must be offered in an individual stint. So before, they were not allowed to offer it for more than 18 months to a given individual at a given sort of service event. They now can extend that out to 2 years. That is a much better picture for young people, to be able to have a longer extended period of receiving support for their employment. So there are a wide variety of things that are now required by VR services through WIOA. And I think it gives us some real important talking points for shared interest that VR should have in serving, I would say, our population, and that we have in helping them access VR services. And with that, we can open up for questions and discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Maryann. And I appreciate it. I was taking notes. So it's always helpful to hear about other systems that are supportive of young adults as they move into that adult world. Discussion. Johanna's encouraged you to use the chat box, but we have a small enough group that if you want to take yourself off mute and have questions or comments from what has been provided by Maryann.
Maryann, we don't have any questions in the chat box right now. I'm doing like a verbal replay for you, but there are a couple of folks typing. I'm curious, we'll see what these questions are as they come in. I'm curious about what recommendations you would have. There's quite a bit of state mental health agency leadership on the phone with us today about what your recommendations would be about initial outreach or bringing vocational rehab folks to the table so you can do some of that mission alignment that you were just talking about. Where do folks start if this is a good connection for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think it depends on if you have an established relationship with VR or not already. I think VR agencies generally are they're trying to figure out how to do this. And I think in general, the way to connect in some ways is sort of a gentle, hey, we're aware of WIOA and would love to hear about kind of the changes that you're making or have already made, and thinking about our population, the population that we work with, who are, the youth categories that WIOA focuses so strongly on and think about them together and see how we can work together to help that proceed in the way it's supposed to proceed. I think the concrete piece is sometimes state VR agencies they have really focused on young people with or they've focused in general on individuals with intellectual disabilities and less on folks with psychiatric disabilities. And then other states have more people, the largest population they serve are individuals with psychiatric disabilities. So getting some sense of, in some ways, their comfort level in working with young people who have psychiatric disabilities. It's not our favorite term, but that's the term that they would use. Would be also an important thing, and being able to offer your expertise up for helping them to succeed in meeting these essentially these mandated elements, I think is a great place to start. So really just like an open conversation. Can we learn about what you're doing? Let me tell you about what we're doing, and maybe we can put our heads together to serve this particular youth population better.
Yeah, that's great, Maryann. Like some very core principles of good collaboration practice with the specifics of using what WIOA presents as an opportunity from both sides as your connection point. Yeah, that's great. We have a couple of comments that I'll read for you and then give you some time to respond, and we're going to move on to the next portion of our discussion. So Candy is sharing a couple of things. One about an experience in her community. The high school offers job training classes for those on IEPs. But when asking about access to VR services, the teacher said that would happen closer to his senior year, so that 18 age, even though he's close to 16 years old. So I don't know if you have any insight about when that age requirement and what communities might be doing for the 16 to 18-year-olds. And then also Candy notes that she lives in a rural area, and there's been a challenge in keeping a VR counselor position filled, which I'm sure is not a challenge just from where she is.
Yeah, so it's not required, VR is not required to reach out at age 16. It's just good practice, because that's when people are starting to think about what they want to do when they get done. And so I think, I mean, it's frustrating to be told that, really that connection will happen at age 18, and I think sometimes the school system doesn't know about these changes. These are partly put in place to start at age 16 so that people can get started faster. So perhaps, I think, Candy, if you want to download the brief that we have at our center, that there's the link on this too, to maybe share with the person who's heading up that great work program, and then maybe they can help you connect sooner, or anybody else who's in that program for whom that would be appropriate. So it doesn't mandate that VR has to do that, but really the intention is to get started early and do some stuff before you're actually looking to start work. And yeah, boy, the frustration of having folks not be able to keep a position filled, particularly in a rural setting, and you don't have very many people there to begin with who are in that job. I'm afraid I don't have any great advice on that, other than to say I know it's frustrating, but it's important to keep on finding out who is that person. So the school should know at any point, so that if you say, could I just meet with the VR counselor, they should know who that is.
Thank you, Maryann.
Awesome.
And Johanna just posted the link to the guide.
Oh, wonderful.
In the chat box. So, okay, shall we move on to criminal justice?
Sounds great. All right, so the criminal justice system is clearly a system we'd like to help the young people we work with avoid. It is, however, as I'll show you, a system for which they have great high risk of being connected to and getting involved with. So I think in previous discussions, you guys probably have talked about connections to the juvenile justice system. One of the reasons I was excited to have this opportunity to talk to you today about adult systems is that it's when we come at sort of supporting youth in transition to adulthood from our kids' lens, we sometimes forget about the adult justice system, partly because we'd like to forget that it's there. And other times it can be a really unknown quantity. Typically, criminal justice folks don't necessarily work closely with the adult mental health system either. So sometimes within the mental health system, there's not a lot of expertise around how to connect with them. And yet it is incredibly important that we do so in a really meaningful way so that we can help the young people that we work with or that we know to avoid being involved or to avoid any deeper involvement than they already have. So if we can go to the next slide, let's do our discussion question. Johanna, do you want to lead this discussion question?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Maryann proposes several questions for us to think about a little bit here today. So starting with, does your criminal justice system do anything differently for young adults than for the rest of the criminal justice involved population age group? And here we're really curious to know about the experiences in your community because they are different across the country. And so things to consider. Is there, do they have a separate prison or a prison section for young adults? Is there a separate court for young adults? And have probation officers with specialized young adult, do you have probation officers with specialized young adult caseloads or young adult training? And all right, folks are jumping into the chat box to share. Some of you are on the phone with us. You may have muted yourself, and you can unmute and go ahead and share some experiences from your community.
And it's okay to say you're not sure, because then we can talk about how one could find out some of this information, which is critical to collaboration. And I know
that invitation, Gwen. Yep.
Yes, Denise has said that she's not sure. So I think that that's probably something we should ask Maryann about, how one might find out the answer to some of this.
So not seeing the response, right. Is that the primary?
Yeah, so Maryann, we're hearing some, not sure, but they do not think there's anything special for this population. Generally not anything happening, and we've got some folks still typing.
Okay. And Maryann, because you may know Massachusetts better than some of the other states, one of the comments is, I would say, generally not happening in Massachusetts.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on in Massachusetts, so we can talk about that.
All right. Maryann, some are sharing about the work that law enforcement and police officers are doing in terms of being trained on working with young people with mental health diagnoses, but not specific knowledge about the prison or the court system.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear that there's been a big change in community policing and in the availability of training for community police about how to interact in a better way with an individual who has a mental illness, and particularly for when it's that mental illness that may at that very point be contributing to the reason that the police were called. So I'm glad to hear that in some of your communities you're aware of some of that training. Most of that training has not focused on young adults, but it's a very fortunate thing to have in general when it's been done. So if we don't have other comments, let me move quickly into, it sounds like overall that either folks aren't sure or they're not aware of anything, or they are sure that they're not aware of anything. They're sure that there's not much there. So let me talk about both sort of why this is coming up, why it's important for us, and then provide a resource for maybe digging a little further into what might be going in your own community. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to bring this home, and maybe we don't really need to for this group today, but we really do see an awful lot of involvement in the justice system for young adults who have, this is a slide from some data here in Massachusetts, of individuals who were involved in the state's case management system as an adolescent, so sometime between the ages of 13 and 19 is the cutoff here, just to show the overall arrest rate, having had at least one arrest in each of these years of age. And as is not surprising, we see males having more of a risk. The thing to notice is that the highest rate is at age 18, and that is actually the peak age of arrest in the general population, as well as, I would say, for our population. And with at 18, about a third of them having experienced an arrest. So, and when you get arrested at 18, that's the criminal justice system, not the juvenile justice system. Unless you're in Connecticut, in which case it could still be the juvenile justice system. So we can talk about that briefly as we get down to some of these other things that are going on. And just to say, this 10% arrest rate in young women, roughly, across these ages, is actually a hugely elevated rate compared to young women in the general population. It's really pretty unusual for women in the general population to have an arrest. So the relative risk for the young women that we're talking about today is really quite high. All just as a way to say that involvement in the criminal justice system is a real risk for many of the young people that we work with or that we know. If we go to the next slide, this is the group that I would suggest folks get in touch with to get some read of what might be going on in your community if you don't feel like there's a natural connection point through your criminal justice system. So the criminal justice system would be composed typically of the court system, and then the Department of Corrections, and then the Department of Probation. Usually those are the three elements in the criminal justice system. Sometimes some of those are kind of housed together. Sometimes probation is within corrections. Sometimes probation sits with courts, so it varies from state to state. The reason that I suggest that you may want to get in touch with the folks at the Council of State Governments is that they are in many ways observing and trying to facilitate a current conversation that's going on nationally about recognizing that the way that we treat young adults in our justice systems does not seem to make sense. So there was a huge shift in the juvenile justice system in the past 15 years to try to make the juvenile justice system more rehabilitative and more developmentally appropriate, using a much more of a youth development type of perspective. And there were arguments made before the Supreme Court of using neuroscience, developmental neuroscience, what we know about the way the brain develops, that allowed the Supreme Court to put sort of a hard line at age 18 to say that adolescents are not capable or responsible at the same level that an adult is because their brains don't allow them to be that way. And as we all know, there really isn't any magic at 18 that suddenly says, okay, now your brain is ready to be responsible and take on all the responsibilities of adulthood now on your 18th birthday. And folks are really starting to say, well, what about those young adults? We're changing the juvenile justice system, but we've got lots of young adults that are mostly in the criminal justice system, and can't we do a better job? If we do a better job with them, society will benefit tremendously. So the Council of State Governments did a report. It's this report with on this link that tries to provide a picture of this new focus on young adults involved in it's both juvenile and adult criminal justice systems, with some of the debate being should juvenile justice be extended age upwards, usually talking about up to age 21, so that if you commit an offense as like a 20-year-old, rather than being in the criminal justice system, you would be processed through the juvenile justice system. One of the advantages of that being that it is more developmentally appropriate, there being more attention to helping people actually get their high school diploma and start an adult work life, more recognition of the role of families. There's just a whole array of ways in which the juvenile justice system is more developmentally set up to serve young adults better. So there's a national debate going on that way. If we go to the next slide, some of the reasons that there is this debate, besides the fact that you could just make the natural observation that there's no magic at 18 that suddenly makes somebody an adult, is people are really observing these incarceration rates. So 20% of young people in the juvenile justice system are actually legal adults. They're between the ages of 18 and 20. 21% of individuals who are sent to adult, state, and federal prisons are young adults. And of that 21%, 40% of them are young black males. And so young black males are in the 18 to 21-year-old age range are 10% of the prison admissions yearly. The other thing that people have observed, so we've got this huge group of young adults in prisons and in jails. They're also in our juvenile justice system. And one of the things that we know is that their recidivism rate is really quite appalling, meaning that they get rearrested. And when you get rearrested and reprocessed, typically your punishment only goes up because you're now a reoffender. And essentially the system is looking for a better way to prevent that. So if we go to the next slide. So the Council on State Governments has made a set of recommendations, and this is kind of like the WIOA. I think it is a place from which mental health systems, particularly those that are focusing on this age group, could reach out to folks in courts, in probation and corrections, and essentially bring this forth to say, you know, this is really being made as a set of recommendations for ways to tailor supervision meaning parole or probation, and other services that people are connected to when they're on parole or probation to address young adults' distinctive needs because of the nature of where they are in their development. Then you can see that these are, I would say these are really quite positive, targeted cognitive behavioral approaches. This is not focused at all specifically on individuals with mental illness, but there are cognitive behavioral approaches to reduce antisocial behavior, really trying to look at career pathways that help them finish their education and move into the workforce. There is a major recognition of the predominant presence of both mental health and substance use conditions or disorders in young adults involved in the justice system, and so there's a recommendation to really connect them to effective services. Life skills training, this could be one of our transition grants, right? These kinds of things that we like to connect transition age individuals to. And then also, you know, this emphasis on family involvement is extremely appropriate in young adults. And so I see this as potentially providing a platform for saying, hey, yeah, we know how to do some of these things. All right, and let's just finish up with, I think it would be the next slide. Talk a little bit about Massachusetts. So Massachusetts actually asked the Council on State Governments to come in and do an analysis of their criminal justice system. I believe it may have included the juvenile justice system as well, but it was a much heavier focus on the criminal justice system. And one of the things, I know this is a very text-dense, don't worry about the text in it for this so much detail, but essentially this is an example of, as a result of pulling in the Council of State Governments, and then they help you work with your state representatives and senators, that they're in the fiscal budget for the state for fiscal year 18 is now this budget of over $1 million that will sit in the behavioral health system of the state and is to be used by law to provide for better outcomes for individuals in the criminal justice system. So it's a way of basically highlighting that getting in touch with the Council of State Governments is really helpful. I would do it in partnership with the folks from your criminal justice system, because you wouldn't want them swooping in and saying, hey, somebody else wants us to analyze you. But the really positive things can happen by inviting them in and suggesting a focus on the young adult population. And because of the prevalence of mental health and then also substance use services, you guys have real expertise to bring to the table to help the justice system have better success. Thoughts or questions?
Thank you, Maryann. We've had a lot of chatter going on in the chat box.
Great.
You'll be glad to know. Some information from Kansas about how separate facilities are based on the severity of the crime. And then Mark from Pennsylvania letting us know that they do have a separate facility for youth and young adults charged as adults.
Yes,
so,
that's great to hear. And just to comment on the, definitely different holding environments, if you will, for different severity of crimes or charges. And one of the pieces that is getting into this national conversation about should young adults who are coming in touch with the criminal justice system be treated differently, there is kind of a large voice that's developing that says something along the lines, for less serious charges or for non-violent charges or for not serious violent charges, they can make a stronger argument for developmentally appropriate and a different kind of set of approaches for young adults than for, let's say, seriously violent offenders.
comments? Heidi has pointed out, Maryann, that perhaps that arrest rate for women is a reflection of sexual exploitation.
Hi, Heidi. Good to hear from you. Certainly, I think that can get in there, although I think the research shows that there is also some of that in the male population. The other thing that I should say about those figures is that sometimes people get to the mental health system through the justice system, that there are an awful lot of people who have mental health needs that it's only identified once they're in the justice system, and then they come to the attention of the mental health system. But yes, absolutely, I think some of that 10% can be for exploitation. It also tends to be, we know that women that are involved with the criminal justice system have experienced huge amounts of trauma. And that any services for them needs to be trauma-informed. Trauma is also prevalent in the men, but to a lesser extent.
I was actually surprised at a conference that I was at last week and went to a presentation on trafficking that they said, like you indicated, Maryann, that national data is tending to say that it's about 50-50 in terms of gender splits. But I liked Heidi's idea of that's something to be looking at.
Absolutely. Yep.
Any thoughts, Johanna?
No, I think this is really interesting, and like you were in the section before, Gwen, I was taking down notes here. Generally, I hear a lot of interest when we're asking young adults what's working and what are those challenges that they really identify. They key into and talk frequently about interest in things like youth courts and those diversion tactics, and with a high level of interest in saying we see and read and hear about things happening in other states. You know, where is the handhold in our own state to be suggesting and moving some changes? So I think this is really helpful, Maryann, in connecting some dots there. And Mark and Heidi and those of you sharing about things that are happening in your states, keep doing that, because I think we're learning from what's happening in your states just via this chat box today. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yep. And I'll just chime in too that increasingly there are mental health courts on the adult side. My understanding is that mental health courts on the juvenile side are still pretty infrequent. But that's another place to potentially connect is at least around the young adults who are being seen in the mental health court, specialty court, if you have one in your community. I find that judges are often really, really interested in talking about mental health services, and the way mental health system can help the people that appear before them in their courts. And sometimes that's the best foot in the door and starting to talk with the justice system. They also often know who it is, like in the, if you have a Department of Probation, they often know who it is within the leadership there who might have a particular interest, and again, you can leverage that person to then have the broader conversation.
Okay, great.
All right. Shall we talk about colleges and training?
Talk about colleges.
All right. So we're back to a system that we want to get people involved with as much as possible. So I wanted to talk a little bit in this section, if we go down to the next slide, you know, about some details about college and training. And so we're starting off with kind of knowing something about where, when high school students have a serious emotional disturbance, where we think they want to go when they're done with high school. And so this polling question is if you think this statement is true, which is that high school students with emotional disturbances in special education are more likely to attend community college than they are to attend post-secondary technical or business training. Which of those do you think is most common? Is it true that they're more likely to attend community college or post-secondary technical or business training? True.
People are responding, Maryann. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so Maryann, about 2/3 are saying true and about 1/3 are saying false.
Okay. Let's go to our next slide. So actually it depends on how far they are out of high school. So this is data from the National Longitudinal Transitions Study, which is a nationally representative study of students who have been in special education when they were in secondary school or high school. And so this was looking at their transition plans and then what they attended. And what they found was for students who were in the SED category, that in the first couple of years out of high school, a slightly larger percentage of them actually attended vocational business or technical training than attended two-year college. The other thing I'd draw your attention to is how few attended a four-year college. But when you look at 5 to 8 years out of high school, we see that, all right, so the numbers have grown for both groups, but now it's two-year colleges that are a little bit more dominant over the other vocational business or technical training. I think the take-home on this is that for a lot of youth that we work with or that we know, what they're going to be interested in pursuing immediately after high school is either a 2-year college or something that will get them further vocational business or technical training. And that I think we would like to see a lot more of them having access to college. We actually don't know an awful lot about what's out there in terms of vocational business and technical training. And oftentimes when we have these discussions, we actually kind of forget to mention training as opposed to just college. It's a lot easier to collect data from colleges. But what we know is that an awful lot of, up to 1/3 of the young people that we work with or that we know will go on to get some sort of additional post-secondary training in school or work or technical area. And that the data, national data about the benefits of that is extremely beneficial, that essentially getting that additional training is equivalent to getting a 2-year college degree that in terms of your lifetime earnings. So encouraging young people to do that is really important. And that, of course, the biggest bump up out of these options is to complete a 4-year college degree. So we go to the next slide. So in general, as I was saying, the higher the education that an individual gets, in general, the more their lifetime earnings will be. It also provides better job stability, so they're less likely to see rapid turnover in their jobs, or like when we have a shaky economic situation like we've experienced in recent years, that the higher the degree is that you have, or the more training that you have, the more protected you are from some of the job losses that folks have. One of the things I think that's important that's coming out of data more recently is that connecting young people to a GED. I think when somebody is over age 18 and they've not completed their high school diploma, we often have the conversation of, well, let's get you your GED. Quite honestly, the data are supporting or aren't in support of doing that unless it's going to help them get into higher education or training. That is, individuals who have only completed a GED do not have significantly elevated lifetime incomes over those who never completed high school. And I think that is really important for us to understand how important it is if we're at a point where getting a regular high school diploma or certificate is not going to be possible by attending high school, that if we're directing youth to get a GED, it should be at the same time that we're encouraging them to take that GED and get further training or education as much as possible, because that's really going to be what's going to make the difference for them. Employers are not valuing GEDs at this point. Okay, and we know that having impairments that are associated with psychiatric disabilities or serious mental health conditions can impact educational performance and attainment. So we have our jobs cut out for us in trying to help more individuals access post-secondary education or training. If we look at the next slide, we know that there is a substantial proportion of college students who have mild to significant mental health issues, that those numbers and proportions are increasing over time, that a lot of the writing out there sort of in the college mental health world right now is around this increasing demand for mental health services for college students and the increasing numbers of college students with mental health needs or conditions. One of the issues that comes up is the capacity of colleges to provide those services, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. And of course, one of the things that colleges really focus on is the rates of suicide or suicide ideation among their students. This rate is higher than it was in the past, and colleges are acutely aware of this. They're often very motivated to talk about providing better supports to their students who have mental health needs. Again, looking for places to have conversations with them. If we look at the next slide, this was from a national survey of individuals who self-identified as having serious mental health condition who had been to college and then they were surveyed about their college experiences. And one of the things that we looked at, this is work by some of the folks here in the Learning and Working Center, was to compare some of the experiences of young adults to older adults. So individuals who were older adults when they attended college as opposed to being in the typical age range of being up to age 24 and attending college. And one of the things then that we would be aware of for the young people that we work with or that we know is that they don't tend to approach disability services. Disability services are the only ways that people can get accommodations, formal accommodations. People can ask informally, and you can see the number who requested accommodations in the bars over to the right are actually higher than the individuals who use disability services. But a lot of that comes just for asking a professor for extra time on something, because things have been hard to handle lately or something along those lines, where students aren't really revealing that they have a disability and they need something, but they feel like they've gotten accommodation. The only way to get a formal accommodation where the professors are obligated to provide them is to go through disability services. And what we find is that people who really could be using disability services often aren't using them. We also find that disability services, kind of like VR services, are more tailored and more comfortable with working with other disability groups. So they're increasingly comfortable working with students with autism spectrum disorders or physical or sensory disabilities or learning disabilities. They often are not as used to or knowledgeable about or comfortable in working with students who are presenting with mental health disabilities. If you look at the next slide. One of the other things to be aware of, and if you're having conversations with colleges, is they often can be very self-protective. And sometimes not even out of self-protection, but in trying to deal with situations that really they haven't come to understand the full implications of. Colleges have put into place a variety of policies that can be particularly pernicious for youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions. So often they have forced absences after self-injury or suicide attempt. And in that forced absence, of course, then a student is no longer attending classes. Sometimes, periods of high stress, it can come at a really inopportune time to not be able to be at school. They sometimes will put in place a very high bar for being able to return to school to prove that a student is able to continue and not be at risk to be self-injurious or to do a suicide attempt in the future. Some schools will literally take financial aid away because of mental health issues, basically judging that a student is not eligible, is no longer eligible, or they won't offer the subsequent year due to mental health concerns. When students withdraw from classes, so you've gotten far enough into the semester that you're past add drop, but things have happened and you have to withdraw, and the withdrawal really is largely because of something acting up in your mental health condition, that schools can have really punitive policies. And between the forced absences, the taking away of student financial aid, the punitive policies, what students are reporting is that their debt is tremendous, partly because of these, because they sign up for, they pay tuition for 4 or 5 classes, and then they have to withdraw, they get no credit for it, they're not allowed to make up the material, but you've still paid that full tuition. So a great resource for describing these kinds of policies and remedies for them can be found at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law at this link. And it's another way to be working with colleges to be aware of, they're probably very open to having discussions about how the local mental health system might support some of their students, or how they might be supportive of students who are coming from the local mental health system, in ways that the system can be supportive to them. But I think it's also important to understand what any given school's policies are that could be having an impact on the students that you might send to them. And then if we look at the next slide, one of the keys to helping young people who are attending college or training succeed is really by having appropriate accommodations. Here at the Transitions RTC, we have this tip sheet. There's also a video on accommodations where we've really tried to dig into what are effective accommodations that college students can reasonably ask for, so that they can succeed academically and in their college life. And what we find is that often disability services are not particularly experienced, and so they like everybody gets additional time. That's just the kind of thing that anybody can get. More time on tests, more time sometimes with assignments, but sometimes the accommodations that students really need are quite different, and it's not going to be the kind of accommodation that somebody with a learning disability is asking for. It may be around where a student literally sits in a classroom, or when their time is going to be broken in terms of needing breaks, how to have accommodations for that. So it's important for us as we're supporting them to know what those accommodations are. And again, in having conversations with local colleges or training environments, this is something you can bring to the table to help them understand here are the kinds of accommodations that help these students succeed. Okay, questions or comments?
I'd invite everyone to again use the chat box, or to be brave and unmute yourself and talk with us a little bit today. Maryann, we had one comment come in while you were talking specifically about this, and that is that Tiffany shares her experience with disability services for mental health in 2 colleges, and it was that there's very minimal support, and that the staff at the college did not necessarily understand. And I think that's something that I've heard in my work as well.
Yep.
I think some residents, we were resonating with some of the things that you were sharing.
Yeah.
So we'll give folks a minute more to ask some questions or share some additional thoughts.
One of the other things that I can say, disability services is sort of a mixed bag. I mean, some offices really do have great knowledge and great supports. Boston University, in their psych rehab center, has really very sophisticated supports, and they're very good. But it's important also for young people to know that you have to, it changes when you go to college. Special education is a right in high school. Getting disability services in college is not. You have to ask for them. And you have to present the information that demonstrates that you have a qualifying disability. So the nature of getting help and supports in college to have accommodations really shifts, and the onus on the student, and that's a really different thing too.
I think in terms of looking at how to collaborate with our partners is maybe key in what Stephanie was saying about folks not understanding. I think programs can offer some support to colleges in exchange for access to some of the students. In one of the HTI grants, there was a partnership with the community college who was very, very happy to offer office space to the program in exchange for having open drop-in hours for students, just because of that issue that they weren't as sure what to do with the students with mental health concerns.
Yep, and community colleges are often really happy to partner. They know often that they have great need in their student population, and I've heard of a variety of places where that has been a really effective partnership, just in terms of those kinds of things that you're describing, Gwen, where they're really looking for some help and support, and they are able to provide something like space or something else. I should also say in the silence that the JED Foundation, J-E-D, has really dedicated itself to college students who have mental health needs, that they have a variety of resources on their website. They also do sort of a, kind of like you can apply to them to get sort of a stamp of approval, and they have a list of colleges and post-secondary programs that have done that. So if people are looking for resources for schools that have at least expressed the interest of being certified that way, who then might also be good partners because they clearly have some interest in doing better, the JED Foundation has a list of those schools, besides a variety of other really good resources.
I'll point out that going back to criminal justice, I'm sorry, going back to our previous conversation about employment, people can notice in the chat box that Heidi posted a resource created in Massachusetts called reachhighermassachusetts.org. So thank you, Heidi, for putting that up there. Well, I think, Maryann, we can move on.
Okay. And I have to say, what I'm seeing on my slide deck is there aren't any specific slides around substance abuse.
I am seeing that too, and I think that was perhaps a mistake on our part. So for everybody who is looking at the slide deck, we are going to spend some time now on interface with services for young adults who have co-occurring needs.
Yeah, so now I'm also not speaking from slides. I'm going to take just 1 minute to see if I can find...
Sure. Please do that, Maryann, and
we'll
send out to people, we'll send out to people those slides. And in the meantime, you can be thinking about experience with supporting young adults with co-occurring diagnoses.
Okay, so I'm not finding that offhand. I have a feeling it's buried in an unusual spot. So let me just talk off the cuff. So please bear with me. So we all had also sort of allocated a little bit less time around this system, in part because it's a really tough system. So on the one hand, we know, that the transition age are the peak ages for developing substance use disorders. We also know that for young people who have a serious mental health condition, the rate of having problematic substance use is extraordinarily high. It's a very high rate of having that use be problematic, and the development of disorders. So, in this age group, we have to be aware that it's important to be able to address that need. It gets, I would say, more complicated, in part sometimes because of some of the conversations now around legalizing marijuana. And marijuana and its synthetics and all of the other various forms of it is by far the most common drug that is used in this age group. If you look at sort of the proportion of drugs used at each age, older populations, which is largely what the substance abuse system is set up around, are typically heavier drug use populations. They're using harder substances and more difficult substances for the system. Young adults typically are using marijuana and its synthetics. So it's present there with the conversation around it being legalized. It is legal here in Massachusetts. They'll be setting up shops next July to sell it in, not for anybody under the age of 21. So in some ways, some of the interesting things about it is that a lot of young people are thinking, it's going to be legal, but still it's not going to be legal for them until they're 21. But it communicates sort of this feeling that society is no longer seeing this as such a dire thing. For young people who are using, sometimes that contributes to their feeling that it's okay and it's not doing me any damage. So we know that there's great prevalence of substance use in this age group, and that this is the peak age for the development of disorder. So no matter what substance you're using, if it becomes a disorder, which means that it's interfering with your ability to function, that we want to be able to address it. I think in part one of the reasons that this is sort of a briefer part of this is that substance abuse treatment is very extraordinarily variable, like mental health treatment is. So the picture of how substance abuse treatment is offered in your local community is probably quite different for each of you. Some substance abuse services actually have a whole separate set of services for adolescents, which our younger transition age youth could access. But for connecting with their adult system, most adult services are really focusing on 30 to 50-year-olds. So it can be very difficult to initiate that conversation to really say, what's available for young people. On the other hand, there is a real recognition in sort of the substance abuse treatment world that young adulthood is kind of where it starts, and some local systems have really started developing young adult programming. And so I think it's important to find out what's available there. Some mental health systems, out of their frustration or some other reason, offer dual diagnosis or comorbid treatment within the mental health system. And so if that's the case where you are, then it's a matter of trying to find services that are developmentally tailored. So sometimes that comes out of the adult system, and like sometimes in the rest of the adult system, there's not a mind or an eye towards what are the unique needs of young adults. So, it is partly a matter of looking to see if there are resources in the local substance abuse system that would be beneficial to this population in terms of whether you should go forth and make that one of the priority systems with which to make a connection. I have to say, in talking with folks about the organization of substance abuse systems, that it really seems to be a extremely mixed bag, and in some ways not as easy to identify. And so it can be a really tough system to figure out locally. But I think the motivation for us is recognizing that this is often a really important need for many young people to help them stay on track with their movement into the adulthood that they want, is to help them not get sucked in or down by problematic or disordered substance use. So I don't know what people's experiences are. I'm curious to know if you've been working with the local substance abuse system, or if you're finding co-occurring services for young adults where you are. Has this been something that you've been thinking about or talking about locally?
Maryann will give folks a minute to use the chat box in response to your question.
And while you're contemplating responding, if you also want to offer up how much you see, kind of what prevalence or to what extent you see substance use as something that's a challenge in the population you're on the phone about, let us know about that. Are you seeing it as a significant problem?
Maryann, this may be a little off topic, but those on the phone are all recipients of federal dollars and therefore participating in program evaluation. And I know in the past there have been questions about use of substances, and I'm curious, wearing your research hat, what you think, how the questions will change when we are asking young adults about substance abuse as marijuana becomes legalized in many, many states.
You know, it's interesting, Gwen, that I think it was Paul Greenbaum down at Florida Mental Health Institute had done some of the early work looking at self-report substance use in individuals who had received child or adolescent mental health services, public mental health services. And there was this fascinating flip at age 21 where the substance that was primarily used was marijuana, much more so than alcohol. And at 21, it flipped over and the substance that was used was alcohol, much less use of marijuana. And I think we all looked at that and said, you know, to some extent that's probably because putting some legal mandate, like you can access it at 21, but there's some real punishment for giving it to, you know, having a minor come in and buy it, or a legal adult buy it and give it to a minor, might be somewhat. I almost wonder if the legalization may have some of the same effect, which is it may actually reduce some of the use in like the 16 to 21-year-old population, because it's in some ways more openly and realistically regulated. That's not to say that they won't find ways around it, because they will. And we may see then, you know, I think in some ways the concern is around, you know, how much more marijuana use will we see with it being legal among those who are young adults, but, you know, 21 and older. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what it brought to mind.
And it was just a thought question of, we've had one comment, Maryann, from Denise in Rhode Island, saying that in Rhode Island, the approaches to young adults with co-occurring is a big problem in their programs. You had been curious about.
Yeah. I'm glad you're reporting that, Denise, just, you know, to kind of validate that it's, I think sometimes when you ask the question, when people who are working with this group ask the question, they sometimes find out that it's more problematic than they may have assumed. Trying to find, I know Rhode Island has I think they still have a consolidated children's agency and then a separate adult mental health. I'm not sure where substance abuse fits in Rhode Island. But it would seem like wherever the co-occurring adult services might be, that might be the place to start to have the conversation about, can we help you make it more developmentally appropriate? And then, you know, the other thing about the strength that you guys bring to any of these conversations with adult systems is typically adult systems aren't real strong on what we think of as youth voice or the voices of people with lived experience. I would think for something like approaching whatever system offers co-occurring treatments or services, offering to work with them to try to make some portion of them developmentally appropriate would be great, and then bringing in youth voice to that would really be a fantastic process for making something that really potentially can work for this age group. I have to tell you, there's no evidence-based treatments out there for how to deliver co-occurring. There's some research developing around co-occurring in people who have trauma or PTSD. Young people, actually, there's a woman in Connecticut who is developing an intervention there under research support. But, you know, really, we don't know exactly what can and should work. We know that motivational interviewing works in this age group, but how to partner that then with also getting mental health treatment at the same time. Just in general, bringing youth voice into that conversation about what that kind of service could look like that would be appealing and then effective would be really great.
Well, thank you, Maryann. We're at time, and you're looking at the link to our participant survey, which helps give us feedback and is important. And as I said, as I opened the webinar, I'll close it, and that is thank you for giving us and sharing with us part of your day, and a big thank you to Maryann.
Happy to be with you all today.
Thank you so
Bye,
much,
everyone.
Maryann. Thanks for hosting, Gwen. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.